Chapter 3. 3 years earlier.
"You've got to be kidding me," Allison said. "Honey, listen to this. You won't believe this. Did you know there was more than one uprising?"
Holston looked up from the folder spread across his lap. Around him, scattered piles of paper covered the bed like a quilt, stacks and stacks of old files to sort through and new complaints to manage. Allison sat at her small desk at the foot of the bed. The two of them lived in one of the silo condos that had been subdivided only twice over the decades. It left room for luxuries like desks and wide non-bunk beds.
"And how would I have known about that?" he asked her.
His wife turned and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Holston jabbed a folder at her computer screen.
"All day long you're unlocking secrets hundreds of years old, and I'm supposed to know about them before you do?"
She stuck out her tongue.
"It's an expression. It's my way of informing you." "And why don't you seem more curious? Did you hear what I just said?"
Holston shrugged.
"I never would have assumed the one uprising we knew about was the first, just that it was the most recent. If I've learned one thing from my job, it's that no crime or crazy mob is ever all that original."
He picked up a folder by his knee.
"You think this is the first water thief the silo's known? Or that it'll be the last?"
Allison's chair squealed on the tile as she turned to face him. The monitor on the desk behind her blinked with the scraps and fragments of data she had pulled from the silo's old servers, the remnants of information long ago deleted and overwritten countless times. Holston still didn't understand how the retrieval process worked, or why someone smart enough to come up with it was dumb enough to love him, but he accepted both as truth.
"I'm piecing together a series of old reports," she said. "If true, they mean something like our old uprising used to take place regularly, like once every generation or so." "There's a lot we don't know about the old times," Holston said. He rubbed his eyes and thought about all the paperwork he wasn't getting done. "Maybe they didn't have a system for cleaning the sensors, you know? I'll bet back then the view upstairs just got blurrier and blurrier until people went crazy. There'd be a revolt or something, and then they'd finally exile a few people to set things straight. Or maybe it was just natural population control, you know, before the lottery."
Allison shook her head.
"I don't think so. I'm starting to think—"
She paused and glanced down at the spread of paperwork around Holston. The sight of all the logged transgressions seemed to make her consider carefully what she was about to say.
"I'm not passing judgment. Not saying anyone was right or wrong or anything like that. I'm just suggesting that maybe the servers weren't wiped out by the rebels during the uprising. Not like we've always been told, anyway."
That got Holston's attention. The mystery of the blank servers, the empty past of the silo's ancestors haunted them all. The eraser was nothing more than fuzzy legend. He closed the folder he was working on and set it aside.
"What do you think caused it?"
he asked his wife.
"Do you think it was an accident? A fire or a power outage?"
He listed the common theories. Allison frowned.
"No,"
she said. She lowered her voice and looked around anxiously.
"I think we wiped the hard drives. Our ancestors, I mean, not the rebels."
She turned and leaned toward the monitor, running her fingers down a set of figures Holston couldn't discern from the bed.
20 years, she said. 18, 24.
Her finger slid down the screen with a squeak.
28, 16, 15.
Holston plowed a path through the paperwork at his feet, putting the files back in stacks as he worked his way toward the desk. He sat on the foot of the bed, put a hand on his wife's neck, and peered over her shoulder at the monitor. "Are those dates?" he asked. She nodded. "Just about every 2 decades there's a major revolt. This report cataloged them. It was one of the files deleted during the most recent uprising. Our uprising." She said "our" like either of them or any of their friends had been alive at the time. Holston knew what she meant, though. It was the uprising that had been raised in the shadow. It was the uprising they had been raised in the shadow of, the one that seemed to have spawned them, the great conflict that hung over their childhoods, over their parents and grandparents. It was the uprising that filled whispers and occupied sideways glances. "And what makes you think it was us? That it was the good guys who wiped the servers?" She half turned and smiled grimly. "Who says we are the good guys?" Holston stiffened. He pulled his hand away from Allison's neck. "Don't start. Don't say anything that might—" "I'm kidding," she said, but it wasn't a thing to kid about. It was 2 steps from traitorous, from cleaning. "My theory is this," she said quickly, stressing the word theory. "There's generational upheaval, right? I mean, for over 100 years, maybe longer. It's like clockwork." She pointed at the dates. "But then, during the Great Uprising, the only one we've known about till now, someone wiped the servers. Which, I tell you, isn't as easy as pressing a few buttons or starting a fire. There's redundancies on top of redundancies. It would take a concerted effort, not an accident or any sort of rush job or mere sabotage." "That doesn't tell you who's responsible," Holston pointed out. His wife was a wizard with computers, no doubt, but sleuthing was not her bag. It was his. "What tells me something," she continued, "is that there were uprisings every generation for all this time, but there hasn't been an uprising since." Allison bit her lip. Holston sat up straight. He glanced around the room and allowed her observation to sink in. He had a sudden vision of his wife yanking his sleuthing bag out of his hands and making off with it. "So you're saying—" He rubbed his chin and thought this through. "You're saying that someone wiped out our history to stop us from repeating it? Or worse." She reached out and held his hand with both of hers. Her face had deepened from seriousness to something more severe. "What if the reason for the revolts was right there on the hard drives? What if some part of our known history, or some data from the outside, or maybe the knowledge of whatever it was that made people move here— What if some part of our known history, or some data from the outside, or maybe the knowledge of whatever it was that made people move in here long, long ago, what if that information built up some kind of pressure that made people lose their marbles, or go stir crazy, or just went out?" Holston shook his head. "I don't want you to think that way," he cautioned her. "I'm not saying that we're right to go nuts," she told him, back to being careful. "But from what I've pieced together so far, this is my theory." Holston gave the monitor an untrusting glance. "Maybe you shouldn't be doing this," he said. "I'm not even sure how you're doing it, and maybe you shouldn't be." "Honey, the information is there. If I don't piece it together now, somebody else will at some point. You can't put the genie back in the bottle." "What do you mean?" "I've already published a white paper on how to retrieve deleted and overwritten files. The rest of the IT department is spreading it around to help people who've unwittingly flushed something they needed." "I still think you should stop," he said.
This isn't the best idea. I can't see any good coming of it. No good coming from the truth? Knowing the truth is always good, and better that it's us discovering it than someone else, right? Holston looked at his files. It'd been 5 years since the last person was sent to cleaning. The view of the outside was getting worse every day, and he could feel the pressure as sheriff to find someone. It was growing, like steam building up in the silo, ready to launch something out. People got nervous when they thought the time was near. It was like one of those self-fulfilling prophecies where the nerves finally made someone twitch, then lash out or say something regretful, and then they'd find themselves in a cell, watching their last blurry sunset. Holston sorted through the files all around him, wishing there was something in them. He would put a man to his death tomorrow if it meant releasing that steam. His wife was poking some great overly full balloon with a needle, and Holston wanted to get that air out of it before she poked too far.